In Chapter 46 of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, Colonel Brandon loans the Dashwoods his carriage for their trip home, and he returns to Delaford. Marianne is pensive during the 2-day trip as she watches the familiar countryside of Barton Park from the carriage window. Every field and every tree brought some peculiar, some painful recollection. Elinor notices Marianne's newfound self-discipline, but she worries her sister will relapse into grief when she hears Willoughby's story. Soon, Marianne and Elinor pass the spot where Marianne first met Willoughby. Marianne has put regret behind her, but says that if she could believe that he was not always acting a part, she would have a greater peace of mind. Marianne regrets her conduct, her treatment of Mrs. Jennings, and her blindness to Elinor's own griefs. In the future, she says, she will temper her emotions, and her memories of Willoughby will be checked by religion, by reason, by constant employment. In response to Marianne's new attitude, Elinor reveals what Willoughby told her. Marianne weeps over the knowledge that Willoughby did indeed love her. Back at Barton Cottage, Marianne asks Elinor to tell Mrs. Dashwood about Willoughby. In Chapter 47 of Sense and Sensibility, Marianne tells Elinor and their mother she's satisfied to have escaped marriage to Willoughby. Elinor agrees, believing his own enjoyment or his own ease was in every particular Willoughby's ruling principle. Even his current regrets are self-centered, having to do with his unhappiness. Mrs. Dashwood contrasts Willoughby's despicable behavior to Colonel Brandon's selfless merits. Meanwhile, Elinor wishes for news of Edward. One morning, their servant returns from town and announces he has seen Mr. Ferrars, who was recently married. Elinor pales. Marianne falls into hysterics, and Mrs. Dashwood realizes for the first time the depth of Elinor's love for Edward. The servant reports seeing Miss Steele, now Mrs. Ferrars, who offered the Dashwoods the couple's best compliments and promised to visit. And he could see Mr. Ferrars in the carriage, but not very well. In Chapter 48 of Sense and Sensibility, Elinor admits to herself that she had continued to hope, as long as Edward was not married, that he would break his engagement with Lucy. Yet, as the days go by, no news comes from London to confirm the marriage. And then one day, Edward arrives on horseback. Elinor composes herself, saying, "I will be calm. I will be mistress of myself." Edward enters, filled with agitation, then blushes when Mrs. Dashwood welcomes and congratulates him. They sit and talk about the safest topic available, the weather, until Mrs. Dashwood asks after Mrs. Ferrars, meaning Lucy. Edward replies that she's well, referring to his mother. Edward refers to his mother in answer to another question about Mrs. Ferrars. Confused and perplexed, Edward finally asks whether they mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars. He explains that Lucy has married his brother Robert. Elinor slips quickly out of the room, and shutting the door behind her, she cries tears of joy. Edward exits the cottage.